And Dr. Brid Smith.
I too want to welcome all the women and men of Dublin Fire Brigade here. They were like a small army on the plinth there this evening in the sunshine, and I think we're all proud of history and fighting recent hotel fires, the accident on Wellington Quay, and indeed the Stardust. The memory of the Stardust is still 37 years later fresh in our minds, and I think this weekend in Croke Park there's an initiative to campaign again for real justice on the question of the Stardust that has left such a mark and a legacy on the history of this city and on the history of the Fire Brigade. When I was a councillor, there was an expert group set up to examine how, basically, I think what they were attempting to do was to get rid of Dublin Fire Brigade out of the control of Dublin City Council, but it was dressed up differently. It was dressed up to examine the functionality and efficiency of Dublin Fire Brigade within DCC. A man called Sir Ken Knight was brought over from Manchester region, I think, a very experienced firefighter who had been knighted, obviously, for the work and his expertise. If memory serves me right, DCC spent about 100 grand, €100,000, on the report produced by Ken Knight, and when it was produced it sat on a shelf, and I don't think it's ever been taken down again, because Owen Keegan did not agree with the outcome of Sir Ken Knight's recommendations. Sir Ken Knight himself went on to go back to the system he worked under in London and beyond, to recommend that the efficiencies that Dublin Fire Brigade achieved in the model that they used of combining paramedics, ambulances and firefighter engines would be applied in Britain, because it was such an efficient and such an impressive system. I think he estimated at the time that he could save about 200 million for the system over there, but we wasted 100,000 on this expert's report and left it sitting on the shelf to gather dust, because, as I say, Owen Keegan didn't agree with it and wanted to push very hard, as he had done when he was previously the manager for Dunleary Rathdown Council. He was pushing very, very hard to unburden Dublin City Council's budget with the men and women of Dublin Fire Brigade and the work that they do. And I think this is an important point, because when you think about the language, Owen Keegan came into the council not as a manager, minister. He came in as a CEO, a chief executive officer, and he started to try and make decisions which were not about the health and safety of the city, the interests of the men and women of Dublin Fire Brigade and those whom they serve, but about efficiencies and how you would, as a chief executive officer, run a corporate identity rather than running a city with all its complexities of people and health and safety issues that go with it. And so, thankfully, because the men and women of Dublin Fire Brigade have consistently fought off and defended the system that they run, thankfully they're here tonight to hear this motion. But they're here tonight to hear this motion because that system is yet again under attack. I want to welcome the government's recognition of the role played by Dublin Fire Brigade and welcome the endorsement of the motion. But like Deputy Osnoddy, I'm a little bit worried about what it actually means. The government acknowledge in their speech here, I just want to sort of pull it out here, the government acknowledge in their speech here, and we'll give copies of this to the firefighters afterwards, that the National Ambulance Service cannot recruit at the level necessary to displace Dublin Fire Brigade paramedic workforce, and so cannot and will not take ownership of Dublin Emergency Ambulance Service provisions. And that's absolutely welcome acknowledgement. Dublin Fire Brigade receives 7% of the funding that is used to answer 40% of the calls on a national level, because Dublin has a third of the population of the city and probably the most complex health and safety issues facing those who have to look after our health and our safety. And I think that this is going to increase in the city, and I think the evidence is there that will increase. Today we heard reports of accidents, road fatalities being increased again year on year and month on month compared to last year. But more importantly, episodes to do with climate change, flooding, wind damage, wires falling down, people falling under, broken trees, etc., and sea levels rising are going to cause us major headaches. And throughout the country, not just in Dublin, we have seen in recent flood and storm episodes the heroism of Dublin Fire Brigade and other firefighters and emergency services. And I think these services are going to be required more and more, not less and less. And so I think that when you look at the HICRA report, and I want to start winding up by looking at the HICRA report, where they say that a key finding of their review, this was published in March 2017, HICRA looked at the progress of implementing recommendations of pre-hospital emergency care service, in other words ambulance services. A key finding of this review relates to the provision of services in Dublin. HICRA found a high level of risk associated with a lack of collective ambulance capacity and arrangements for call, handling and dispatch. Now, this short two-page document doesn't tell you what exactly that teases out, but I suspect that the problem with the high level of risk is not associated with the delivery by Dublin Fire Brigade, but is rather associated by the lack of delivery from the HSE. And I want to preface that by saying this is not a criticism of the men and women who work in the paramedic ambulance service of the HSE, not at all. But it is a criticism of the HSE themselves. And I don't think that's an unusual thing nowadays, and particularly given in light of the recent scandals around the cervical check, one's criticism of the HSE is well fitted and well deserved. I would worry that the criticism is misplaced, and therefore I am concerned that when the Minister says on the question of the NEOC that what is proposed is to transfer all ambulance call taking and dispatch functions to the NEOC, such that all such services across the state are consolidated in one centre. This is required because the current call-taking arrangements represent an unacceptable high patient safety risk and give rise to delays in the allocation of ambulance resources to patients, including in potentially life-threatening situations. And again, I don't believe that the evidence shows us that that applies to the delivery of service by the men and women of Dublin Fire Brigade, but rather the inefficiencies and the lack of leadership and often the mismanagement of the HSE end of the service. So I want to caution about that. And just finish by saying that I think we live in a society where we forget sometimes to talk to the people who actually know what they're talking about, i.e. them who are out every day in the fire stations, on the street, at the accidents, in the houses picking up people who are dying or sick, on the street where there can be major problems, dealing with the impacts of climate change. And unless we talk to them and hear exactly what they have to say about the changes that are required, if they are required, and how they can be delivered, then we're running ourselves into trouble. And we are certainly running ourselves into trouble and into a lesser grade of service and delivery of service if we rely on what I believe is a broken health service executive. The HSE has proven itself most recently in its handling and its mismanagement of the health cases of dying women in this country, that it cannot be trusted. Now, that sounds quite dramatic, but I think before any of this should be implemented, we need to talk in a serious way to the men and women of Dublin Fire Brigade and indeed the men and women of the ambulance service under the National Ambulance Service itself, because my brother used to work there many years. He's passed away now, but for many years he was very frustrated as somebody dedicated to the service that the workers were never listened to when they put across proposals that might help to deliver a better and more efficient service to create a better and safer and a healthier city for all.